I still remember the first time I saw an old American railroad map. Not the kind you might use for travel, but the kind that hung in dispatch offices in the 19th century. The black and white lines bleeding through the city and into the wilderness. And in the middle of it, a giant spine stood out, Rock Island. You might think, what's so great about railroads? But imagine America in 1850, no internet, no highways, no airplanes. Towns were scattered across hundreds of miles of desert. Without trains, you couldn't deliver mail, trade, or even get married. And then, suddenly, a train came along, and everything changed. The Rock Island Line was more than infrastructure. It was a lifeline. It brought farmers to market. It brought country girls to the city to learn typing, then become secretaries, to have a different life. It carried wheat from Kansas to New Orleans. And it also carried love letters from Chicago to small towns where soldiers were stationed. There was a time when every station along the Rock Island was a miniature world. Some towns had no schools, no hospitals, but they always had train stations. Because if the railroad was lost, the town would wither like winter corn. It is no coincidence that many older Americans still call that time the Golden Age. Because at that time, Rock Island was more than just a means of transportation. It was a symbol of hope, of life, and of aspirations to reach far. I once met a 96-year-old man in Davenport, Iowa, the place where the historic bridge over the Mississippi River used to connect. I was born near the railroad, he said. The first night I heard the whistle of a train without my father coming home was the night my mother cried until morning. That was the time he died in a train accident. But despite that, we never hated the railroad, because it was the only thing that held our family together for generations. His story made me understand. Rock Island was more than technology or commerce. It was part of a collective memory. It carried the heartbeat of millions of people, something you can't measure in miles of track or stock returns. Which is why, when the Rock Island Line collapsed in the 1980s, people mourned not just a company, but an era. In 1847, amid the dust of the opening of the West, a group of Illinois investors gathered in a small town with a metaphorical name, Rock Island. But there was no island, just a patch of land on the Mississippi River that had been a trading post for Native Americans. Fur traders, and early settlers. They formed a company with a name longer than the road they were about to build, the Rock Island and LaSalle Railroad Company. It sounded complicated, but their goal was simple: to connect Chicago, a city that was rising as a commercial powerhouse, with the west bank of the Mississippi, where Iowa and the promising new lands lay waiting to be exploited. At that time, railroads were still foreign to many Midwesterners. They were used to horses, wagons, and riverboats traveling down the Mississippi. But the founders of Rock Island understood, whoever controlled the traffic controlled the future. In 1851, the company changed its name to the Chicago and Rock Island Railroad. Marking its first major milestone, they began laying the first rails from Chicago to the southwest. By October 1852, the first test train ran from Chicago to Joliet. It was only 45 miles. But it was 45 miles that changed the history of transportation in the Midwest. At that time, building a railroad was not simply a matter of nailing and laying rails. They had to negotiate with farmers for land, cross muddy fields, fight harsh winters, and most importantly, they had to convince people that the train was not an iron monster, but an arm of civilization. There is a story that, in a small town near Morris, Illinois, when people erected telegraph poles along the tracks, many farmers thought they were rain-calling devices. One old man even told his children not to look at the wires, for fear that the ghost machine would come out of it. But when the first train rolled into Rock Island in February 1854, the doubters were silenced. It was more than a train, it was a symbol of hope. Now, a man from Chicago could reach the Mississippi in a day. And that opened the door to Iowa. In 1853, on the other side of the Mississippi River, a new company was born, the Mississippi and Missouri Railroad Company, created by the founders of Rock Island. Their goal? To expand from Davenport, the small town across the river from Rock Island, deep into Iowa. They were not idle dreamers. They saw a trend, seized an opportunity, and built an empire one iron bar at a time. When the historic Mississippi Bridge was completed in 1856, the first railroad bridge across the Mississippi, They had done the impossible. But with success comes trouble. On May 6, 1857, a steamboat named F.E. Afton crashed into the bridge, causing fire and extensive damage. The ship's owner sued the railroad company, claiming that the bridge was dangerous to navigation. The controversy raged throughout the region. The press dubbed it the war between the railroads and the water. One of the young lawyers defending Rock Island was Abraham Lincoln, who would later become President of the United States. He argued, "Railways are the means of the future. They operate all year round, whereas steamships can only operate when the rivers are not frozen." The Supreme Court ultimately sided with Rock Island, a decision that shaped the future of American transportation. With the legal victory, Rock Island merged with the Mississippi and Missouri, creating the Chicago, Rock Island and Pacific Railroad Company, a name that would become synonymous with American railroads. And so the empire truly began. The railroad extended into Kansas, Texas, stretching west to Denver, Colorado, climbing north to Minneapolis. Branch lines branched out everywhere, a nerve network gripping the Midwest. Freight trains, passenger trains, mail trains, animal trains, all were in constant motion. Night trains carried hundreds of people across the desolate plains, like giant iron dragons. Rock Island even organized special runs for artists, politicians, and even circuses across the state, turning the trains into mobile stages. From a small Illinois company, they became the indispensable lifeblood of America. From the late 19th century to the mid-20th century, America was in a boom period. Populations were growing rapidly. The economy was booming. Industrialization was spreading from the East Coast to the West. And if there was one symbol that connected it all, it was the railroad. And in the jungle of railroad companies, Rock Island stood out like a pillar in the whirlwind. It was not the largest, but it was one of the boldest and most distinctive. Rock Island carried more than just goods, it carried the culture, the mood, and the rhythm of life of a changing America. At its peak, Rock Island operated routes from Chicago to Denver, Minneapolis to Texas, connecting the industrial heartland with the distant prairie. A Nebraska farmer could get on a train in the morning and be in Dallas by night, something that would have taken 2 to 3 days of horseback riding before, if he hadn't gotten lost in the desert. No one can deny the social role of the Rock Island trains. They were the interstate buses of old America. They not only helped you get from point A to point B but also helped you shape a new life. Many people left their hometowns on the Rock Island to go to school, to find a job, to escape an arranged marriage, or simply to disappear. And conversely, the same train brought them back when they were successful, or failed. The station was always the starting point and the end point of many life stories. Someone said, "Just hearing the train whistle, I know it's time to start over." Not only has a wide coverage, the Rock Island is also famous for the quality of service. The trains are luxurious, the cabins are comfortable, the dining car serves grilled beef, and light music fills the cabin. The flight attendants wear uniforms as neat as pilots, always friendly and proper. Some of the Rock Island's notable lines that made history. The Rocky Mountain Rocket, a high-speed, for its time, train that ran from Chicago to Denver, with first-class cabins, dining rooms, and scenic views. The Twin Star Rocket, connecting Minneapolis and Houston, running across the state like a giant artery pulsing between north and south. The Peoria Rocket, the Texas Rocket, the Corn Belt Rocket, names that seem to have been taken from legend, evoking the romance of the journey and the generosity of old America. It's no wonder that newspapers of the time referred to the Rock Island as the Titanic on land, flashy, comfortable, and influential. A little-known fact: many Midwestern towns were founded because of the Rock Island train station. No train station, no people. No people, no town. And so the first stops were train stations. Then coffee shops, motels, pharmacies, schools. A community was born from a single track. In Iowa, Kansas, Missouri, there were dozens of small towns that were once marked on Rock Island maps. And to this day, many old people still point to their homes by landmark. My house is 2 blocks from the old Rock Island station. Even though the station has long since ceased to operate, Rock Island was not just a geographical connection, it was a memory connection. Remember, back then, trucks were not common. Air freight was expensive, so if you were a manufacturing business, Rock Island was a savior. Corn from Nebraska, beef from Kansas, steel from Chicago, machinery from Illinois, all passed through Rock Island. It is no exaggeration to say that this route fed the entire Midwest, bringing food to the cities and industrial goods to rural markets. Advertising, retail, and agriculture all depended on train schedules. Train delays could affect corn prices, delay workers' paychecks, or even cause chaos in shipping schedules. A 1942 press photo shows hundreds of mail bags piled up at Rock Island Station. Mail from the military to the families of American soldiers fighting in Europe. The Rock Island carried nostalgia, anticipation, and hope for a return. But like all dynasties, the glory days didn't last. By the late 1950s, Rock Island was under pressure from cars and airplanes. People began to prefer driving, and low-cost domestic airlines began to proliferate. The once proud interstate trains were starting to look outdated to a new generation. Revenues were falling, systems were aging, competition was fierce, but Rock Island's leadership stuck with it, because they believed, the train is the backbone of America. And America cannot live without a backbone. Rock Island entered the 1960s as a wounded giant. On the outside, it still had a long line of trains. Hundreds of cars long still rolled between Chicago and Kansas. But on the inside, things were starting to fall apart. Since World War II, Americans' travel habits had changed dramatically. Cars were no longer the preserve of the upper class. Now every suburban family had a Ford or Chevrolet parked in front of their house. People no longer came to Rock Island every morning, they drove to the office. Afternoon trains were running out. Cars empty. The only sound left was the sad music of the wheels on the rails. Domestic air travel was booming. Urgent goods, mail, important passengers, all took to the sky. Rails began to become the third option, after planes and trucks. Rock Island was now an old man trying to maintain his aristocratic style in a changed world. They still used locomotives from the 1940s. They still ran long, unprofitable routes. They still had a cumbersome management system where every decision had to go through 3 levels of departments. The world was changing fast. Rock Island was as slow as the trains it operated. In an effort to save its dying empire, Rock Island's board of directors made a bold decision: merge with Union Pacific Railroad, one of the largest railroads in the United States. Union Pacific was then harboring ambitions to create a super transcontinental line, connecting the East Coast to the West Coast, and Rock Island was an indispensable piece. The plan sounded great, but the reality was like walking through a tunnel without lights. The merger was fiercely opposed by rival companies. Smaller companies feared that Union Pacific would become a shark that swallowed the ocean. The states that owned land under Rock Island's control were also worried about losing control of their local economies. Dozens of hearings followed. Federal officials, especially the Interstate Commerce Commission, began to scrutinize every provision. And so began a legal process that lasted more than 10 years, from 1964 to 1974. During that time, Rock Island was stuck. They dared not make new investments, because they were waiting for the results of the merger. They could not cut loss-making lines, because they feared losing value in the eyes of Union Pacific. The waiting to die situation dragged on like a death throes that dragged on day by day. Just when everything seemed to be over, a fatal blow was struck. Union Pacific, after a site inspection, discovered that Rock Island's infrastructure was in serious disrepair. The locomotives were rotten, the rails were bent, the electrical signals were outdated, and the repair costs were estimated to be in the hundreds of millions of dollars. They saw a rusty machine drifting on the quicksands of history. In addition, the ICC imposed harsh conditions, demanded the sale of lines, revenue sharing, and continued unprofitable service in remote areas. Union Pacific sighed and withdrew. 10 years of negotiations, thousands of hours of testimony, millions of dollars in legal fees, all gone up in smoke. Not giving up, Rock Island attempted a complete restructuring. They rebranded themselves as The Rock, repainted the cars, changed the logo, and hired a marketing expert to rebrand the company. A grand makeover, but only on the surface. Inside, the machine was still crumbling. They attempted to open a grain line from the Midwest to Galveston, Texas, hoping to make up for it by transporting agricultural products. But due to lack of investment, the line was in disarray. In March 1975, Rock Island filed for bankruptcy for the third time in its history. It is said that if a company goes bankrupt once, it is a failure. Twice, it may be fate, but 3 times, it is certain that something is seriously wrong with the system. In 1979, the Rail and Airline Employees Union, BRAC, launched a nationwide strike, paralyzing almost all of Rock Island's operations. There were no dispatchers, no ticket agents, no one to load freight. The trains sat idle, like dusty zombies on the tracks. The ICC declared a transportation emergency because Rock Island could not get its grain to market, threatening national food security. On January 24, 1980, a federal judge signed an order to completely dissolve Rock Island. Assets were liquidated, rails were uprooted and sold for scrap, and rail cars were scattered across other companies. A legend is officially dead. They say Rock Island died not because of lack of visitors, but because it was too old to change. When the liquidation order was signed in January 1980, the Rock, the final name of the Rock Island Railroad, officially ceased to exist. But strangely, rather than being immediately forgotten, the Rock Island seemed to live on, not in offices, but in memories and infrastructure. After the railroad was broken up and auctioned off, hundreds of cars, locomotives, stations, and hundreds of miles of track were divided among other companies. Some went to Union Pacific, others to BNSF, and some became the property of small contractors. Rock Island cars, with the bright red letters, "The Rock," still printed on their bodies, were scattered from Oklahoma to Minnesota, like pieces of memory blown across the Midwest. A small company in Texas bought hundreds of old freight cars to refurbish. Another turned an abandoned station into a restaurant or museum. And there are towns, like Blue Island and Silvis, where people preserve every lamppost and nameplate from the Rock Island era as relics. Some former Rock Island employees, train dispatchers and car maintainers, have formed memorial groups, sharing old photos, schedules, uniforms, and more on handwritten flyers and, later, on the internet. Most amazing of all, a portion of the Rock Island network is still in operation today, but under a new name, the Metro Rock Island District, a suburban rail system serving Chicago and its surrounding areas. The line still carries thousands of commuters from suburbs like Joliet and Blue Island to downtown every day. The tracks that once belonged to Rock Island now have new paint. The cars are more modern, but the spirit is still the same. A commuter boarding a train from Tinley Park on Monday morning might not know anything about Rock Island. But the train they were on, the track it was rolling on, it was the living legacy of that illustrious railroad. And so, the Rock Island, though legally dead, continues to run. The Rock Island left behind more than just tracks and cars. It left behind cultural, social, and collective memories. Many older Americans still recount the story of taking the Rock Island for the first time as a milestone in their lives. It could be the trip to get married, the first time away from home for college, or the last trip to bring their father home in a wooden coffin. In places like Iowa or Missouri, the train station was once a community center, a place where you not only waited for the train, but also listened to live music, read the news, played dominoes. There was a small town in Kansas that held a summer festival around the Rock Island station, with jazz, a fair, and a contest to see who could tell the best train story. For generations, the Rock Island represents a time, a slower pace, but a more meaningful one, a time when you had to wait hours for the next train. And that time allowed you to meet, talk, and connect, something we're losing today with our smartphones and cars. The Rock Island line has even found its way into American poetry and music. The song, Rock Island Line, originally a prison folk song, was later covered by Johnny Cash and many other legendary artists. Becoming a national hit, the chorus repeats like the rhythm of the train. The Rock Island Line is a mighty good road, if you want to ride. You gotta ride it like you find it. The song isn't about the company. It's about the dream, the American dream, of freedom, of journey, of choice and opportunity, that the Rock Island once represented. The story of the Rock Island is more than just the story of a railroad. It is a microcosm of American economic history, from boom to bust. It teaches us a hard lesson. Just because you matter today, doesn't mean you'll be kept tomorrow. Rock Island created hundreds of towns, carried millions of people into the future. But because it failed to adapt, failed to innovate, failed to reduce its internal bloat, it was left behind by history. This is not just a story about a railroad. It is a warning to every business, every organization, and to each of us as individuals. So there you have it. Rock Island was once the soul of America. From the whistle that blew across the rice paddies, to the train that lit up at night, from the love letter carriages to the freight trains that carried hope. It's gone, but it's never gone. It lives on in memory, in the veins of our modern transit system, and in the stories told by the people who lived along the tracks. If you ever stand at LaSalle Street Station in Chicago and watch a metro train roll by, remember, you're seeing the ghost of Rock Island, still quietly carrying out its mission of connecting people and land, as it has for more than a century.